Good morning. I'm pleased to welcome the participants to this first of two lectures in the Varela Memorial Lectures. I wish to greet Delia Padaranga and Wina Varela as I fondly recall my personal friendships with Don and Francis, which predated our associations with FEF. In the early months of the pandemic, the messages swirling around the FEF Viber group crystallized into workshops and prospects on the prospects and imperatives for a post-pandemic scenario. The common concern was the impact of the sudden stop in the economy on employment and incomes, and what action should be taken to create jobs in the emerging labor surplus scenario. The discussions eventually boiled down into two work streams, agriculture and labor. Yeah, so this is the agriculture work stream team. The team includes well-respected experts in agriculture, and they're all smarter than me because they managed to cajole, coerce, and compel me to be the one to put together the results of the discussions and present our ideas. So I've organized the discussion according to this outline, a broad scan of the economic record of agriculture, the reasons for that satisfactory performance of the sector, among which we focus on defective property rights and restricted land markets. And before discussing our proposals, a short digression on the occasion of this Padaranga Varela Memorial Lectures. I make a reference to the FEF bias for market approaches which inform our proposals. And spoiler alert, we discuss the case for the condonation of debt of the agrarian reform beneficiaries, although this is not yet the official position of the FEF. And then we go into the proposals, and then we'll focus on agrarian reforms, and we'll end with some open issues, because I don't think we have all the answers at this time. Okay, so the next slide, agricultural value added per capita is even more discouraging. It shows that GVA per capita has hardly increased in the long-term past. And in fact, today's GVA in constant 2000 prices is at the same level as it was back in 1970. The trend growth on the right shows that it's also been declining. It's been negative in the last 7 years. The share of agriculture in employment and GDP declines in the course of economic development and industrialization, and we see this pattern in our peer countries. Industrialization, however, requires a strong agricultural base for raw materials and exports. But in the case of the Philippines, the decline in the share of agriculture in GDP has been relatively faster than the decline in the share of labor, indicating weak growth in productivity compared to industry and services. In terms of total factor productivity, again, the Philippines has been lagging behind in terms of the growth compared to our peer countries. And among the peer countries shown here, the Philippines is ahead only of Myanmar and Timor-Leste. In terms of physical productivity, tons per hectare, as compiled by Dr. Rolly D. of UANP, we have the same disappointing story. We are behind Vietnam in rice, coffee, rubber, sweet potato, and we're behind Indonesia in corn and coconuts. We are behind Thailand in sugarcane and cassava. We're only ahead in two crops, pineapple and bananas. But even here, Thailand is catching up. That's in the next slide. So pineapple and bananas were all the crops that we were ahead. And in terms of uh, crop diversification, we have also scored very low. No? Indonesia's 8 main crops, 6 are heavily export-oriented. Vietnam has 9 main crops, 5 are export-oriented. In Thailand, rice is dominant, but agriculture is diversified and export-oriented. And the leading exporter in rubber, cassava, canned pineapple. Number 2 in rice is sugar, and ranks very high in tropical fruits, poultry, and shrimps. While the Philippines, we only have 5 main crops, and only 2 are export-oriented. So the agricultural sectors in these other countries are major players in global markets. Agriculture used to be the source of two-thirds of our exports, but in recent years, it's been down to like 9% in 2018, and it's low compared to other countries which are more export-oriented. On the other hand, in terms of imports, we have a high share of imports. Agriculture has a high share of imports compared to the other countries. So it shows that we are more import dependent on agricultural products compared to these other countries. This slide simply shows that the agriculture is not attractive to the private sector investments at all. It investments in the agriculture are trivial in terms of amounts, or the way the doctors would say it. There's only a trace element of investments in agriculture, both from FDI and in terms of BOI registered investments, and they're limited to a few high value crops. I now turn to agriculture and poverty. First, in terms of poverty, overall poverty in the Philippines, we still have the highest poverty among these peer countries, and even higher than Cambodia. And the thing is, Cambodia had a higher poverty rate than the Philippines as recently as 2005. And in these other countries too, we see that the rate of drop of poverty has been faster than in the Philippines. Also, Thailand, as recently as 2005, they had a higher poverty rate than we had. In terms of generations, it's actually not too bad. We're about the same level of inequality as Indonesia, Malaysia, and and Vietnam. But Cambodia's better income distribution, and income distribution is worsening in Vietnam, is improving in Thailand. This graph shows that poverty is a rural phenomenon. 57% of Filipinos reside in rural areas, and rural poverty remains at 30% relative to urban poverty is at 11%. And households which depend on agriculture as their main source of income are the poorest, with a poverty rate of 49%. The reasons for all this dismal performance of agriculture are amply explained and documented by Tina David of UP Los Baños and our very own Dr. Rahel Briones. The historical policy bias against agriculture in terms of trade policies, lopsided priorities which emphasize self-sufficiency rather than food security, land equity, consumer welfare, the inadequate provision of public goods, because agriculture by nature is prone to market failure, and the response of the private sector uh, will be to underinvest because of these market failures, defective property rights, constricted land markets, and weak institutional governance. But there are explanations. There are explanations. None of these reasons uh, give something which look to be actionable, except for these two uh, items here: defective property rights and constricted land markets, which we focus on as things that can provide actionable uh, policies to address the problems of the economic recession. I just want to make a brief digression on the FEF approach. This is the mission statement of FEF in our website. Our hashtags are good governance, secure and well-defined property markets, market-oriented reforms, and consumer protection. Many FEF members are actually veterans of the skirmishes in pushing through these reforms during the past, I guess, 2 decades. So we saw the liberalizations in foreign exchange controls, foreign trade, foreign investments, the privatizations of all these things that we forget were used to be government corporations, and then we depoliticized oil prices for some before, when every time the OPSF had to uh, was depleted and had to be replenished, oil prices had to be raised, and then there would be militant outcry against the OPSF. And when that was abolished, uh, we all got used to the fact that oil prices can go up and go down. Same with exchange rates. A big challenge to get the EVAT passed, which created the fiscal space. And also we used the bill operate transfer to solve the power crisis. So many of the FF members are veterans in all of these skirmishes, but they continue to be active, whether in the front line with the congressional hearings or in the supply lines, providing ideas and research. Also, our legal team has been very active because it's important to maintain a critical mass of reforms and the deliberate speed of reforms. As we know in physics, mass and velocity leads to momentum. So if you read the book, I hope you purchase the book. It shows our dislikes: myopic populist policies, wasteful thinking, the reverse Midas touch, in which the government, every time the government does something, it crumbles, rent-seeking, protectionism, anti-competitive behavior. And then on the other hand, you have the likes that we're familiar with FEF, the bias for markets, relies on market signals, foreign investments, privatization, the private sector as the engine for growth, PPP, freer and flexible labor markets, and rationalized public transportation. I also want to mention that the FEF espouses, advocates these reforms not just through press releases, but actual, work with the congressional committees on draft legislation and forums and discussions to help spread the ideas. And for example, we were very active in the Agricultural Free Patent Reform Act, which removed Commonwealth era prohibitions to sell or mortgage a property within 5 years that the farmer gets the grant of the free patent. And also working on uh, current bills which have been certified as urgent to remove the deadline on the application of the agricultural free patent. So just very quickly, these are our uh, the workstream proposals for agricultural reforms. The agri lending is inherently risky, too risky for banks whose main funding source are deposits. The compulsory minimum lending requirements present a deadweight loss to society, and it's better for them to just pay the fine. So our maximum position is to remove agri lending altogether. Second best would be to remove the distinction between agri and agra, set the minimum at 15%, or broaden the scope of alternative compliance. And I think there are certain bills already filed to this effect. We have proposals to modernize the 1912 law on warehouse receipts to take advantage of technology to improve farmers' access to financing by allowing them to collateralize their warehouse certificates. We're also proposing to expand crop insurance coverage that will allow the farmers to shift the natural risks to crop insurance and assist them in terms of being able to obtain financing from banks. Some proposals on forestry reforms. The forestry cover of the Philippines has gone down from 17 million to 7 million. This can be best addressed by planting more trees through tree plantations. However, the current regulations which are aimed at protecting natural and residual stands actually discourage tree plantation and wood processing, but illegal logging continues anyway. So we're supporting the DNR administrative order liberalizing tree plantations to uh, allow plantation owners to establish plantations and also wood processing plants. Finally, we also have proposals on rational land use policy and strengthening the land administration system. These are reforms that will again strengthen the markets for agricultural activities. We go to agrarian reforms. Just to put together all the different features of Philippine agrarian reform, to borrow from Raul Fabella, it's like redistributing poverty, and it's equity at the expense of efficiency and productivity. It's the longest running agrarian reform program. It has lasted 35 years, or even 60 years if you go back to the Bakamangal Land Reform of 1963. In Japan and Taiwan, this did not last more than 5 years. The coverage is extensive. All agricultural lands, all crops, all tenurial arrangements, targeting 80% of agricultural lands. Japan and Taiwan only covered rice lands, only 4.7 and 14% of lands respectively. Malaysia has no comprehensive land reform, just a coexistence of managed land schemes of big and small owners, and the FELDA and FELCR have been successful modes of poverty alleviation there. We have a very restrictive 5 hectare retention limit. Anything above the ceiling is given to landless and smallholders. The allocation of the above ceiling land is done by the government, not through markets. And uh, our land reform program is collectivized. No? The performance of DAR is measured in terms of hectareage distributed. So they gave one collective certificate of land ownership award to groups of farmers instead of subdivision surveys and individual titling, which affects 50% of all CLOAS. There are also severe restrictions on the transferability of the redistributed lands. The farmer cannot sell except to a qualified buyer. The transferee cannot own more than 5 hectares. sale, transfer, or lease the donation not allowed within 10 years after the award, except to an heir or to the government. All heirs have equal rights, and it's very difficult to manage if there's an absent family member uh, in the CLOA, i- in the ownership. There's a prohibition of transfers until death. Usually a 30-year tenure is fully paid. Land distribution is based on size, not productivity. You cannot lease out the land without clearances and approvals from DAR. Yeah, finally, Philippine agrarian reform is forever. Despite the expiration of CARP in 2014, the 5-hectare ceiling, the limitations on transferability, and the authority of DAR to approve conversions continue to be enforced. RA 6657 did not have a sunset clause. CLOA awards also have no provision for generational progression. As in the song, it's like first love. It assumes the farmer beneficiary never dies. There's a study on rural productivity and incomes by Adamopoulos and Rusticia using a mathematical model on cropping, farm sizes, and occupational decisions of farmers. It concluded that 1998 land reform reduced productivity by misallocating resources among farmers and distorting occupational decisions. Average farm sizes decreased by 34%, and productivity went down by 17%. So the outcomes of all of that, all of those features of the Philippine Agrarian Reform program have been small farm sizes, fragmented cultivation. These two are different because Vietnam has small farm sizes, but they've consolidated cultivation. High poverty, low productivity, low investments. There have been reduced incentives for land improvements, non-functioning land markets. If I could use the framework of Ronald Coase, the non-functioning of land markets deprives the farmer the ability to uh, achieve the best use and the best benefits, highest benefits for the land that he owns, also the best use and best benefits for society as a whole, because the land markets are not working. Farmers are trapped in a new form of bondage. They're saddled with dead capital in the land, to use the expression of Toti Chiquiamco. They cannot sell, lease, or mortgage their farmlands, and the farmers are at the mercy of informal lenders. So they're living under a very defective property rights regime, uncertainty on the property rights under CARP, reduced collateral value of land, and inefficient land rental market, no economies of scale in agriculture, and very high transactions cost. What needs to be done are two general things: remove the impediments to land markets, the 5-hectare ceiling, the transferability, and the authority of DAR to approve conversions, and also to remove impediments to land consolidation, which means to parcelize collective CLOAS and give subdivided titles and remove restrictions on leasing. So the problem with collective CLOAS is that they've in fact fostered communism among those groups that have received collective CLOAS. As Tote Chiato says in the book Momentum, without individual titles, they have no sense of secure ownership to promote entrepreneurial initiative. The study on split uh, published by DAR shows that some of these titles have remained unsubdivided for more than 20 years. And they've resulted in boundary conflicts, issues on encroachment, impediments on land amortization payments for those awarded compensable lands, and problems of second-generation transfers for deceased uh, agrarian reform beneficiaries. And basically, they hold insecure and stable property rights. Okay, this gives the information on the uh, acquisition and distribution of land by different modes of acquisition, and it shows how much were done through collective CLOAS and how much were done through individual titles. And that 46% of the LADs were given through collective CLOAS. And the highest would be voluntary offer to sell, VOS, the GFI, 73.2%, the voluntary land transfer, and the government-owned lands. Uh, this shows that the DAR was trying to be efficient on their side at the expense of the property rights of the farmers. Okay, we want to zero in on the compensable lands, which is 1.6 million of the 4.8. This is based on the land bank amortization table. But you'll see that all of them are way below the 5 hectare retention limit. The graph on the right side, the average size is 1.7 to 1.8. Focusing on the 1.6 million, uh, there are two general categories. You have those that are paying either partially or fully, uh, of only about it's about 7 million in debt of 272,000 uh, arms. Total principal balance of 58.7 million has to do with those which are not being amortized or those which are for several reasons. And we'll see that later on. Without the land distribution information schedule with the land bank of 44.2 billion or 406,000 aggregated reform beneficiaries and 14.5 million, 44.5 billion of outstanding debt, which should be amortized, but there's a very high level of past due. These are involved 233,000 aggregated reform beneficiaries. So in this table, we will calculate hectares per beneficiary, outstanding debt per beneficiary, and the value of the land that each beneficiary would have. So outstanding debt for beneficiary would be 69,000 for the total sector, of which 22,000 per ARB for those that have been paying partially or fully. For those with a bigger outstanding balance without the LDIS, the outstanding debt per ARB is 108,000, and the ones for the which are amortizing is 53,000. If you use an assumption of 120 pesos per square meter for farmland, an estimate of the farm value of the that the LDIS ARBs have would be 230,000. That's 1.92 hectares per ARB multiplied by 120 square per square meter. Next slide. So this just depicts the same information. On the left side, you have total debt outstanding of 44.2 billion for the non-amortizing debt of 406,000 ARBs, and then 13.8 billion outstanding for 257,000 uh, amortizing but not but past due. And then on the right side, you have the size of the debt per beneficiary, 108,000 per ARB in the non-amortizing category of the 406,000 beneficiaries. Next slide. Why has there been no amortization? The document from DAR on the split program uh, shows that collective CLOAS are not able to amortize their debt because they don't have the LDIS, the Land Distribution Information Schedule. And it's only on the basis of this lot allocations that the land bank can set up the schedule. So the land bank cannot issue the LDIS because they don't have individual titles. So an estimated, according to the study, 290,000 ARBs have been unable to pay land amortizations due to the lack of the LDIS on their parcels. So the study quotes some ARBs in Batangas and Iloilo who have not been able to amortize their land, their debt because of the lack of the LDIS. And even if they wanted to pay their debt, land bank would refuse any payment, even if it's voluntarily offered. So okay, so this just shows again that you have on the left side you have the average size farm size per ARB, and then on the right side a pro forma land asset value per ARB, depending on their category. And we show that for the ARBs in the non-amortizing category of the farmland value of 230,000 for those 406,000 ARBs. Tries to demonstrate what the problem is. On the liability side, the average collective CLOA farmer beneficiary has debt to the national government of 108,715. It's debt to the national government, not to land bank. I explain that later on. On the asset side, the beneficiary has farmland worth 230,476. That's just 1.92 hectares times 120,000 per hectare. However, the farmer beneficiary cannot sell, mortgage, or lease the land during the 10-year prohibition period and until the 30-year loan to the national government is fully paid. There are transferability restrictions, as we've seen earlier, and the ability to participate in an agrarian agribusiness venture arrangement requires approval from DAR. On the right side, even if she wanted to, the farmer is not allowed by land bank to pay the amortization to the national government in the absence of LDIS. And the land bank cannot issue the LDIS because there's no unsubdivided title in the CLOAS. So the farmer is in a catch-22 situation. Now, this is supposed to be relieved by the split program funded by the World Bank to subdivide the collective CLOAS. However, this will take 10 to 15 years or by 2031 at the earliest. And then if the farmer is able to amortize the land bank loan for 30 years, the earliest she can sell, mortgage, or lease the farm is by 2061. The average age of the Philippine agricultural workforce is 57 years old. So that farmer will be 97 years old by the time she'll be able to uh, do something about the land in terms of being able to sell, mortgage, or lease it. Because, and then of course, the CLOA doesn't provide for generational succession. I think this demonstrates that it's the farmers are in a new form of bondage. They're caught in a trap of being tied to their land that cannot take any value out of it, and they'll be there forever, simply because they there are restrictions on their transferability. They also cannot repay the debt because the titles are not subdivided. So on those persistent restrictions after 2014, these are some of the proposals which the agricultural Workstream team have put forth. So remove the 5-hectare limit in the 10-year prohibition on conveyance, transfer the authority to convert lands from DAR to a new Department of Housing and Urban Development, and transfer the quasi-judicial authority of DAR to DOJ. This require amendments to the law or new legislation altogether. Okay, now come to the case for debt condonation. So this is the term sheet on the parameters of the what would be a debt condonation program. So a starting principal of 58.7 billion, consisting of those without LDIS of 44.2 and 14.5 billion of outstanding but not being amortized, annual interest payment of 6.4. The debt is not to the land bank but to the national government. The land bank is only a processing intermediary. Uh, they collect the payments remitted to the Bureau of Treasury. They keep track of the payments, and they annually they submit to the Bureau of Treasury the status of the debt and amortizations. So this is a pro forma calculation of the what would be economic benefits, assuming 120,000 pesos for value of the output per hectare. You're talking about 1.22 million hectares. And if you are able to recover the 70% increase in productivity from that Adamopoulos Rastucia study, it's like an economic flow of 24.8 billion annually. Now, this is an economic theoretical type of calculation that, for example, NEDA would use to calculate economic NPV or economic IRR uh, based on the economic benefits in general. On the other side, in terms of fiscal cost, this would be real cost. This would be a real, in terms of cost, in terms of 58.7 billion write-off, which only represents 0.3% of GDP. Also, the annual collection of land bank for those national government debt is about 0.28% of national government revenues, and there would be 6.4 billion of foregone interest. Pros and cons of condonation. Uh, well, he has a strong argument for social justice because, in effect, the government has degraded the value of the land with the imposed restrictions, and it will provide a economic stimulus that will free farmers from their bondage, and they'll be able to increase their productivity and earn more. It will enhance the productivity of the land if they can be leased for consolidated farms. The cons that have been cited are moral hazard. For example, it could be unfair for those who paid for the land already, and then those which are not yet paying, there will be a free rider problem. Also, the fiscal cost to the national government, and that this will be a broad sweeping move, and there could be unintended consequences that we really cannot anticipate at this point, and can get out of hand. But there are arguments in terms of that coordination is a win-win proposition because the farmer beneficiaries can spend more to increase their production. It will enhance food security. Successful farmers can expand via leasing. Yeah, it will solve the land fragmentation problem. We can I'll show that in greater detail later on. Farmer beneficiaries who can lease land can receive an annual rental income, so a more stable source. And society wins through increased stable spending and increased collective rural prosperity. So the question of moral hazard, the concerns that irresponsible borrowers will go scot-free, and it will be unfair to those who have already paid. We can quantify the problem. So we said earlier, you have compensable ARBs, which were prevented by the LBP from paying their loans in the absence of their subdivided titles. So you can say that the agrarian reform itself prevented them from paying even if they wanted to. So it's not a question of there being irresponsible borrowers not paying. They're simply not able to pay. That has to do with the 406,000 uh, ARBs with no LDIS. And then you can also say that for the 250,000, 257,000, those with past due are not paying. I think you can also make the case that the agrarian reform program itself restricted the value of the land and prevented them from being able to earn enough to service the debt because of the transferability restrictions. Now you have the 270,000 ARBs who have paid either fully or partially. Uh, so this will be the case for those distribution, whether it's been unfair for them. But we can consider preferential reverse mortgage programs that can be offered to this minority group, uh, which will allow them to liquefy the equity that they have in the land and generate cash flow for further investments. There's a recent precedent uh, under the Free Irrigation Service Act, which was signed into law in 2017. RA 10969 exempted farmers from with land holdings of 8 hectares or below from paying irrigation service fees and condoned all unpaid ISFs and the penalties uh, in all past due accounts. There are pending bills for debt condonation. For example, Senate Bill 268 introduced by Senator Recto, which repeals Section 226 of 6657 on the repayment by beneficiaries of their debt, and also House Bill 6817 or the Rice Bill, which provides in Section 24 the condonation of loans of agrarian reform beneficiaries for land acquisition and under government land distribution programs. The draft legislation that we are working on has several features. So condoning unpaid amortizations and other charges, and also working on the uh, legacy restrictions that came with 6657 that have not uh, been terminated. So the transferability of agricultural lands uh, and title registration increases, and also allowing banks to be able to hold to acquire land without having to get clearances from the agrarian reform or other government agencies if the acquisition of the land is the result of mortgage foreclosures. and the bank will not hold title to the land for a period longer than 5 years, as provided in the General Banking Act. Finally, we turn to issues in land consolidation. So, uh, if you have cleared the issues on the, just go back first. So finally, we turn to the issue of land consolidation. Uh, if we have cleared the issues on transferability and the issues on the status of the debt, there still be the problem of how the land will be consolidated. Okay, this chart shows the distribution of farm sizes in Southeast Asia. You'll notice that Vietnam has 88% of their farms below 1 hectare. But there's widespread consolidation. Well, because the government can more or less dictate how the land will be planted in what pattern. In the Philippines, the average farm size is 1.7, and farms below 1 hectare are 38%. And uh, 88% of the farms in the Philippines are less than 5 hectares. And over the years, the average farm size have dropped. In 1981, average farm size was 2.85 hectares. By the 2002 census, this has shrunk to 2.01. And we saw that right now it's about 1.7. Same thing in terms of the size distribution of lands, shifted land mass size from larger farms to smaller farms. By 2002, the share of farms under 2 hectares increased to 26%. As Raul Fabellas pointed out, no, small farms are not attractive to private capital. They're too small to be economically viable. For example, to employ modern machinery and technology. The private capital will not weigh in when competitive scale is not there. That requires hundreds, perhaps thousands of hectares, and none is available. There are administrative reforms post for consolidation. For example, DAR should account for the 4.8 million hectares it has distributed and probably try to identify by land use per allocation how to make the consolidation easier. Of course, there's also the project of the World Bank to fund the parcelization of the collective CLOAS, but this will take 10 to 15 years to complete. So the three general possible strategies for consolidation would be parcelize and consolidate. That's the current scenario. You also have the agribusiness venture arrangements, which is allowed but actually limited in scope at this point, or also offer whole consolidated CLOAS for lease to a private firm. A third option, which Dr. Fabelli just wrote about in Business World in January 10, would be to use a consolidating institution like a GFI or the NDC as the intermediary between private investors and the ARBs. Private investors would prefer to deal with one credible consolidator than multiple ARBs. The land bank would write long-term lease contracts with ARBs and their heirs, specifying rights and obligations. The private corporation will deal with just one institution, pay land rental to land bank, which then land bank will distribute the lease payments to the beneficiaries. And then the ARB family members will have higher priority in the farm project. And then the private agricultural firm, which manages the CLOA, can then have a consolidated farm project. Next slide. Okay. Now the possible sequencing of these reforms depends still on the political acceptability of these proposals. The split program of subdividing collective CLOAS will take 10 to 15 years. So it will take up to that time to be able to get subdivided titles. Now, the removal of the 5 hectare limit may not be politically feasible immediately, but take longer until the time that you can have Philippine agriculture with larger owner farms. No? In the meantime, you can have debt condonation and you can have legislation that will enable land transferability that will allow consolidation through leasing in AVAS and through a GFI consolidator. This sequence of reforms, I guess, is the one compelling reason why we should consider debt condonation this time to be able to go into consolidation as soon as possible through listing while waiting for these other reforms. I think that's it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.